Okay, Chapter 11, Part 2 here. So this is where we left off, the Hays Code. The Hays Code was a code that was established in 1930 by the movie industry to censor itself regarding showing nudity or glorifying antisocial acts like violence. And this actually came in response to public pressure from conservative groups and others, and there were three goals: prevent the production of films that would lower morals, influence filmmakers to produce more morally sound content, and then also prevent the production of films that ridiculed, quote, natural or human law. This lasted for a few decades, and but by the 1960s, the Hays Code was replaced by the rating system, rated G, rated M, rated R, rated X, which has been replaced. Not really replaced, but I think you could say it's evolved to the system that we use now, that you're all familiar with because you watch movies. Rated G, rated PG, rated PG-13, rated R, and then you have rated NC-17. Right. So there's always, since very early on, there's been an attempt to kind of regulate the kind of content that is produced out of Hollywood and more generally. And there are 4 stages of U.S. broadcast regulation. Now, this is broader now than just movies. This is the entire broadcast spectrum. Prior to 1911, there was no regulatory authority whatsoever. In 1912, the Radio Act of 1912 was passed, and it required that all large ships maintain radio contact with ships or shore stations. And it made the Commerce Department's Bureau of Navigation in charge of all radio regulation in the United States. And this lasted about 15 years, till 1927. And note, this is important, it was really easy at this time to acquire a radio frequency. That part of it wasn't really regulated. By 1927, as a result of that relative lack of regulation, things got very messy. There were thousands and thousands of radio stations and a ton of interference, right? Like when you're driving between 2 towns and there's like that point where you're getting 2 different stations on the same station. That was happening. But that was like, even if you were just in the center of the city, you'd get all this kind of interference. So then the Radio Act of 1927 was passed, and it created the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC. It gave the government greater regulatory and enforcement powers over radio, as well as establishing the premise that the airwaves were a public good and limited. So it was decreed that anyone who operated radio frequency should do so for, quote, public convenience, interest, or necessity. So you can't just like Uncle Bob just wants to have a radio station for the fun of it. You can't do that, okay, with the Radio Act of 1927. And what the FRC did is they went down and they shut down a whole bunch of stations. And that was great because it limited interference and it organized and it regulated. And a lot of people said that this is exactly what's needed. But what happens is the small-time people, religious institutions, educational institutions, they got swallowed up. It was the few people that could essentially boast the most money, the most power, the most listenership. They were the ones who were favored in all of this. So we ended up with fewer stations, but they were powerful stations. And this kind of starts that trend toward concentration of ownership in the radio industry. And then in 1934, the Communications Act was passed. And the FCC, which I'm assuming you're all familiar with, the Federal Communications Commission, was established. And that's where we are. We are in the era of the FCC since 1934. There's an important Telecommunications Act passed by the FCC in 1996. It was the first major overhaul of telecommunications in the U.S. since the 1930s. And it had some objectives. One objective was it sought to limit indecent speech on the internet, but it also was designed to foster more competition and break down concentrations of ownership but it's been heavily criticized because a lot of people point to the fact that concentration has actually increased since 1996. It has not decreased. So let's look at the FCC a little bit more closely. What do they do? Well, they oversee licensing and operation of broadcast stations in the United States. Their stated goal is to try, or one of them is to try to ensure diversity and competition. And one example of that is when they broke up the AT&T monopoly in 1984, right? It regulates radio. They have a lot on their plate, the FCC. Radio, TV, satellite, and cable. They do not officially regulate the internet, but they do regulate broadband. So it gets kind of confusing, like what falls under the FCC's domain and what doesn't. So just to give you an example of something that they do, or that they've done, they are the ones who enforce the rule that states that cigarette and all tobacco ads are prohibited on radio and television. Have you ever seen a cigarette, like a Marlboro ad on TV? You probably never have, right? Unless you saw like something really old from way back in the day, because that's prohibited, right? You won't hear it on the radio either. That's the FCC's domain. They also seek to ensure that all Americans have affordable access to broadband internet services. And we've talked a little bit about this. Some people criticize because they say our internet speeds are slower and yet we pay more money than a lot of other countries. The FCC licenses broadcast stations. They may revoke licenses or levy fines for the airing of obscene or indecent language when children are likely to be viewing. Have you ever noticed how content changes late at night? Like there are certain things that they can say on TV after 10 o'clock at night when kids are supposed to be sleeping than before 10 o'clock? That's because of the FCC. Nudity. People can get into trouble with the FCC for nudity. Knowingly broadcasting a hoax. The War of the Worlds broadcast is an interesting example. You should go onto YouTube and search War of the Worlds broadcast and listen to it. It's really entertaining. What happened was Orson Welles, a popular radio presenter at the time, listened to by millions of Americans, he basically got on the air and said, what you're about to hear is just acting. And then he proceeded to just go on with his show, interviewing somebody and playing some music. And then he starts to say, it's a long story, you have to listen to it, but basically, long story short, they were doing all these breaking news and there were all these explosions and aliens were invading the earth in New Jersey. And people were listening to this, and if they didn't hear the first part of the broadcast, they got really terrified. And some people actually started to try to leave and head west, right? It's called the War of the Worlds broadcast. You can't knowingly broadcast a hoax, right? Orson Welles probably would get into some trouble with the FCC if he did that today. Orson Welles is dead, but if somebody tried that today, they would probably get into some trouble with the FCC. One important goal for the FCC is universal service. They want to make sure that everyone has equal and affordable access. So there are to telecommunications. So there are 6 principles of universal service. First of all, quality service at affordable prices, access to advanced telecommunications and information services throughout the U.S., including rural areas, and that's the third point, access in rural and high-cost areas. You should not be penalized if you live in a rural area. Equitable and non-discriminatory contributions to the preservation and advancement of universal service. Specific, predictable, and sufficient federal and state mechanisms to preserve and advance universal service. And finally, access to advanced telecommunication services in elementary and secondary schools and classrooms, healthcare providers, and libraries. Now, these are I think most people would agree that these are some pretty noble goals. Where some people might criticize the FCC is on their on the extent to which they've actually achieved these goals. You know, if you look at cost, people criticize cost. If you look at equal distribution. A lot of people note that elementary schools in the inner city lag behind elementary schools in the suburbs, right, or in wealthier areas. The FTC is a little bit different. It's a different organization, a different body, different government body, the Federal Trade Commission. They are responsible for handling consumer protection laws. This includes deceptive advertising in print media, electronic media, and online, spam, phishing, trademark infringement, breaches of consumer privacy, false advertising claims. These are all things that fall under the domain of the FTC, right? But here again it gets confusing because with drugs and food, the FDA handles deceptive ads. So it gets a little bit confusing sometimes. But the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, handles deceptive advertisements for food and drugs. But other stuff is handled by the FTC. They also enforced the 1998 Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, which gives parents control over what kinds of information can be collected about their children online. So the FTC and the FCC are very important government bodies. Now, political speech. Some people argue that the Founding Fathers, they were only interested in political speech when they talked about the First Amendment. They were basically, some people argue that the Founding Fathers, most of them, were interested in protecting political speech. In other words, you can criticize the government, you can critique policy, you can do that. But the other stuff, they weren't as interested in. That's what some people would argue. Other people say no. The Founding Fathers were interested in all kinds of speech, right? The equal time rule is an important part of political speech, right? This comes from the 1934 Communications Act, and it said that stations must give equal opportunities, that means equal time and equal use of facilities, to politicians competing for public office. The Fairness Doctrine required broadcasters to seek out and present all sides of an issue when covering a controversy, right? A lot of people would argue that both of these things are really important. A lot of times, though, unfortunately, networks don't really adhere to these principles, partly because the Fairness Doctrine was essentially discarded first in 1987, kind of unofficially, and then officially in 2000. So if you turn on the news now during like an election season or whatever, there's not necessarily quite the balance. And certainly on other issues, talking about presenting all sides, there are plenty of examples when news outlets do not present all sides to a controversy. Children's programming requires a kind of a different set of restrictions and protections. So the 1990 CTA, the Children's Television Act, limits the amount of commercial content permitted in children's TV programming. Thank God. I think it's too much as it is. I think it should be restricted even more. But I'm watching TV. I'm watching Dora the Explorer with my kids, and it's like these commercials. They're not. I just don't think, it's just my opinion, but I just don't think 3-year-old kids should be advertised to because they don't have the maturity to deal with it. They just want to go out and buy the stuff, and I think it teaches a very harmful lesson about consumerism and that happiness is achieved through things. But that's just my opinion. In any case, but the 1990 CTA, that was certainly a good thing because it did limit that to a significant extent, the amount of commercial content that could be permitted on children's TV programming. TV programming for children must be educational. It just can't be pure entertainment. There has to be an educational element. It has to be broadcast during those certain hours when children are likely to be awake. It has to be run weekly, and it has to be at least a half hour long. So these are things that, these are sort of guidelines that are put in place. Something that is very interesting that I have not figured out how to use, but which was mandated by the U.S. government in 2000, is the V chip. And this is a device that allows parents to block sexual or violent content on TV. I need to figure out how to use this. I mean, all that we have on, we only ever have Disney Junior on, anyways. But this would be useful, and I think there are a lot of people that use it. The V chip, and it's on all of the TVs. So any TV that has been purchased, like if you've bought a TV in the last 15 years or whatever, there's a V chip installed on the TV. That's my understanding. Intellectual property rights. So this is kind of a related discussion, right? We could spend a lot of time on this if we wanted to. It's an interesting area of law, but intellectual property, ideas that have commercial value, such as literary or artistic works, patents, business methods, industrial processes. These are things that are protected, right? And you should protect yourself if you have any sort of intellectual property. If you invent something, you should patent it. That gives you the right to produce and sell your invention. It gives you an exclusive right. 17 years. It's yours. People can't use it, or else you can make money off of them. Okay? Copyright. If you write a song, if you write a movie, if you write a book, produce a video, whatever, get it copyrighted, right? And also trademark laws. These are for signs, logos, names. So don't get these two confused. Copyright is different from trademark. If you write a song, you get that copyrighted. If you have a logo like McDonald's, that is a trademark. Nobody can use it. This image that I have right here, this is a violation of trademark law. If McDonald's saw this, and if they wanted to, they could go, this is somewhere in China, where you can see what they did. They added an arch to the McDonald's arches, so now there are 3 arches, and then they just misspelled McDonald's. But it looks like McDonald's. If you were just walking by and looked at it really quickly, same color scheme, that is a violation of trademark law. McDonald's could sue these people if they wanted to. This is kind of an interesting debate on Jay-Z. He used, and you can just read this article, and if you want to listen to the song, you can go on to the 2 songs. You can go on to YouTube and listen and search for the song KHOSARA, which is an Arabic song produced in Egypt in the 1960s by a famous singer named Abdul Halim Hafiz. And you can listen to that song, listen to like the music, and then listen to Jay-Z's song Big Pimpin'. Listen to the clean version. I don't want to get in trouble. You don't have to do this, by the way. I'm just if you're interested. But what happens is, and you can hear it clearly, Jay-Z just straight up took the music for KHOSARA and made it into the beat for Big Pimpin'. But as this article will show you, I'm not going to test you on this. This is just kind of interesting. But you can read it if you want. It's interesting. Jay-Z might not have done anything wrong. I'll leave it at that, because he kind of did get permission. But some people say he didn't get permission from the right people. In any case, that's kind of our discussion on press freedoms and restrictions and press and speech laws in the United States. Let me know if you have any questions. Chapter 12, which is longer, if I remember correctly, will go up later, probably later in the week or on the weekend. And then chapters 13 and 14 are pretty short.